Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Okay, welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. This is Jim, and today we're going to continue in our history of Christianity. And we're almost at the end of the 2nd century. We had talked a little bit about Marcus Aurelius and his ruling from AD 161. He, in 180 AD, he was not really succeeded by, but there was joint rulership between he and Commodus, and then 8 years later Commodus took over. And Commodus really was fairly decent to Christians. They were more or less ignored because there was a civil war going on in the time of Commodus, so they had more pressing matters than to chase around a bunch of religious people. Now, he was eventually replaced by a guy in AD 193 named Septimius Severus. And if you hear me rattling around my notes, I'm going to be referring back and forth to this guy. So, to summarize the 2nd century of Christianity, they weren't in constant persecutions. They were persecuted sometimes in one area of the empire and not in others. And since the general policy of the empire that was laid out by Trajan, they weren't to be sought out, but if they were brought in before the authorities, they had to be forced to either recant or be killed. So that was the situation throughout the 2nd century. Now, that also went on well into the 3rd century. There was really no systematic persecution of Christians. It was sporadic, just like it was in the 2nd century. It was illegal to be to actually be a Christian, but the people who followed that faith were not sought out by the authorities, same as with Trajan. Martyrdom depended on local circumstances, and a lot of it depended on the goodwill of neighbors. If somebody wished harm on a Christian, and that had to be done, all that needed to be done was to present an accusation, and just as was the case with Justin Martyr, he was accused by his rival Crescentius, and at that time, as in Lyon and Vienna, it was the mob that finally took care of Justin Martyr, not really law. So he was pretty much taken by force. It was mob rule. It was almost a lynching, if you would. So what else was going on in the 3rd century? The Christian people felt the need to refute rumors and misconceptions regarding what they believed. And even if their arguments didn't convince others of what Christianity actually was, there was something very tangible now being gained if the false reports of what they actually were dispelled. So that was the task of some of the ablest Christians and thinkers, known then as apologists, people who would defend the faith. And there are a number of great apologists today. I'm thinking of one right now, Ravi Zacharias, one of my favorite thinkers. So a lot of these apologists back in the 3rd century were trying to dispel the misunderstanding of Christian practice or Christian teaching. For instance, Christians gathered every week to celebrate what they called the love feast. Now, this was done usually on the Lord's Day, Sunday. It was done in private, and only invitees, those who had been baptized into the faith, were admitted. Christians called each other brother and sister, as many do today. And married men spoke of their wives as sister. Now, among these facts, the imagination drew a picture of Christian worship as, this is to the non-believers, they're looking on Christians as some type of organization which had an orgiastic celebration in which Christians ate and drank to excess, vented their lusts in indiscriminate and even incestuous unions. That was a total lie. But since that gave rise to another rumor, Christians spoke of being nourished by the body and blood of Christ. And since they also spoke of him as a little child, some people came to the conclusion that as an initiation rite, Christians somehow concealed a newborn in a loaf of bread and then ordered the neophyte cut in half. The neophyte Christian, the new Christian, to cut the loaf in half, thus cutting the infant in half. These were some of the rumors that were spreading in those times. Now, some even claimed that Christians worshipped an ass. This was a rumor about ancient Judaism that was now extended to include Christians, and thus all of the other people out there mocked Christianity as some type of weirdo religion. And these notions, along with others, were fairly easy to refute for a Christian if you knew what to say, same as today. But it sufficed to show that Christians followed principles of conduct that were not compatible with such wild imaginings, right? And what was much more difficult to refute was the criticism of a number of cultured pagans, parentheses, quotation marks, who took the trouble to learn about Christianity and claimed that it was intellectually wanting. And the same goes on today. You know, David Dawkins and Christopher Dawkins and, you know, a lot of these other naysayers of Christianity. It wasn't any different back then. Christianity was attacked on numerous accounts. And it boiled down to a main point. Christians were an ignorant lot whose doctrines, although preached under a cloak of wisdom, were the rantings of lunatics, foolish, even self-contradictory. And back then, that was a common attitude among the cultured aristocracy, not far from the people that Paul was dealing with back on Mars Hill, who called him a babbler, remember? So during the 3rd century, they referred to Christians as a despicable rabble. And during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, there was one guy named Celsus who wrote a refutation of Christianity called The True Word. And in that, he expressed the feelings of those who, like him, were wise and sophisticated in a worldly sense. And here's what some of his notes were. In some private homes, we find people who work with wool and rags and cobblers, that is, the least cultured and most ignorant kind. Before the head of the household, they dare not utter a word, but as soon as they can take the children aside, or some women who are as ignorant as they are, they speak wonders. If you really wish to know the truth, leave your teachers and your father, and go with the women and the children to the women's quarters, or to the cobbler's shop, or to the tannery, and there you will learn the perfect life. It is thus that these Christians find those who will believe them. And it's not really that different today, people. Now, at that same time, There was a pagan named Cornelius Fronto. He wrote a treatise against Christians that no one knows the whereabouts of today, but the Christian writer, Ministries Felix, was quoting him when he puts the following words in script. He writes, "If you still even have a modicum of wisdom or shame, cease searching the heavenly regions and the goals and secrets of the universe. It is enough that you watch where you walk. This is especially true of people such as you, who lack education and culture and are crude and ignorant." And many people today accuse Christians of being that exact thing. People who lack education, people who lack culture. Look at the difference between the evolutionists and the creationists. All those eggheads think we're idiots, think we have no culture, we're not educated whatsoever. And then they run up against a guy like Kent Hovind. And none of these guys, these big professors out there in these huge universities like Harvard and Yale and Brown, can hold a candle to this guy. He gets them every time. You want to see something funny, go to YouTube, put in Kent, K-E-N-T, Hovind, H-O-V-I-N-D, and you'll get dozens and dozens of those debates that he did back in the 80s and 90s. And it's really interesting. Today he does an audio blog, or no, a video blog from his place down in Alabama, I think it is, called Dinosaur Land. So the enmity against Christianity on the part of many cultured pagans was not purely an intellectual matter back then. It was based on class prejudice. It was almost like an Indian caste system. The cultured and the sophisticated could not conceive the possibility that the Christian rabble could know the truth that was hidden to them. Hey, Paul said it back in Romans, that their eyes had been blinded. The eyes of the nation were blinded. They didn't get it. They couldn't understand the wisdom that he was talking about. So their main objection was that Christianity was a religion of barbarians, that we derived our teaching not from Greeks or Romans, who were considered, the pantheon of intellect, but from Jews, a primitive people whose best teachers never rose to the level of Greek philosophers. If anything was to be found good in Jewish scripture, they said, it's because the Jews copied it from the Greeks. And their argument went on. The Jewish and Christian God is ridiculous. They claim on the one hand that God is omnipotent. This is their claim that we teach. On one hand, God is omnipotent, high above every creature. But on the other hand, they depict God as a busybody who is constantly delving into human affairs, who goes into every home, listening to what is said, and checking on what is being cooked. And to them, that's contradiction. It's sheer nonsense. In any case, the worship of this God destroys the very fiber of society, they say, because those who follow this ridiculous religion abstain from most social activities. They claim that participating in them would be tantamount to worshiping a false god, worshiping an idol. So their argument is, if such gods are indeed false, why fear them? Why not just join in, like sensible people? The truth of the matter is that Christians, while claiming that their gods are false, continue fearing them as true. As far as Jesus is concerned, it should suffice to remember that he was a criminal condemned by Roman authorities. This historian Celsus even claims that Jesus was the illegitimate son of Mary by a Roman soldier. And if he was truly the Son of God, why did he allow himself to be crucified? Now, they're all thinking, obviously, from a human perspective, not from a universal perspective. Why did he not destroy his enemies? Why did he let himself be nailed to that cross? So Celsus asks this: what could be the purpose of such a visit to earth by God? To find out what is taking place among humans? Doesn't he know that already? Or is it perhaps that he knows, but is incapable of doing anything about the evil unless he does it in person? That's actually a rational argument. But what we preach and truly believe is that we will rise again after death. And it's on the basis of that we, as well as the people back then in the 3rd century and 2nd century, faced death with almost incredible obstinacy. It makes no sense to leave this life, which is certain, for the sake of another, which is at best uncertain. That's the way they thought. And the doctrine itself of final resurrection is the high point of Christian nonsense, said the people, the anti-Christians back in the 3rd century. And they had a pretty rational argument. Unless you have faith, the Christian religion, the Christian faith really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? What will happen to those whose bodies are destroyed by fire, or eaten by beasts, or by fish? What's going to happen to them? Will God scour the world after bits and pieces of each body? What's God going to do to those parts of matter that belong to more than one body? Will they be given to their first owner? Will that leave a gap in the risen bodies of all later owners? These are the arguments that Christians had to put up with back then. So there was a need for apologists back then. There was a need for people to defend the faith. So we're going to dive into this a little further and discover who were some of these apologists in the 2nd century. So their task was the task of responding, and they did it with some of the most remarkable theological writings of the entire 2nd century, and it went on for many years after that. So let's just suffice to deal with the apologists from the 2nd century to the beginning of the 3rd. Probably the earliest apologist, an apology, is addressed to Dionysius, who's really an unknown author, to a certain Quadratus, who's mentioned by ancient historians living in the 2nd century. It was a little after AD 138, Aristides wrote an apology that has recently been discovered in the early 1900s, but the most famous Christian apologist in the 1st century was, I think by far, Justin Martyr. And his martyrdom was what I taught you in the previous teaching. He lived through a long spiritual pilgrimage. He went from school to school, and he founded in what was then the Christian church what he called the true philosophy. Now, 3 of his works were extant 2 apologies, which are really part of a single work. And one is the dialogue with Trypho, who's a Jewish rabbi. And then one of his disciples, Justin Martyr's, is Tatian, who wrote an address to the Greeks, another apology. Now, about the same time, Athenagoras composed a plea for the Christian and a treatise on the resurrection of the dead. Then later on, in that exact same century, Theophilus, who was Bishop of Antioch, wrote 3 books to Ortelius, who dealt with the doctrine of God, the interpretation of Scripture, and the Christian life. And all of these apologies of the 2nd century were written in the Greek tongue, as was also the refutation by Celsus, and which was titled Against Celsus, which Origen wrote in the 3rd century. So a lot of these things were also written in Latin Two of the earliest apologies are by Octavius, or actually titled Octavius. They were written by Maecenas Felix, and then Tertullian wrote one called simply Apology. And throughout the years, even to this day, scholars aren't in agreement as to which of these apologies were written first. I don't really think it matters. It's clear that whoever wrote the last one was indebted to the first one. But when you read all these apologies, historians can see what were the main objections that pagans raised against the new religion, Christianity, as well as the manner in which most cultured member of the church responded to them. How Christian theology developed in the very act of responding to pagan objections. Now, let's take it just a little bit further, okay? Now, since Christians were being accused of being uncultured barbarians, they were forced to take up the issue of the relationship between their Christian faith and pagan culture. All Christians agreed that the worship of the gods, the pagan gods, and everything related to that worship had to be rejected. And that was the reason why they abstained from civil ceremonies, wedding feasts, sacrifices and vows made to the gods, small g. So this, together with a lot of their pacifist convictions, led many Christians to the conclusion that they couldn't become soldiers. For the military was required to offer sacrifices to the emperor and the gods. So there were a lot of Christians who objected to the study of classical literature, where the gods played an important part, and where all sorts of immorality was okay, it was ascribed to them. So, to be a Christian required a commitment to the sole worship of God, and any deviation from that commitment was a denial of Jesus Christ. That's the way they thought. Who in the final judgment would in turn deny the apostate. Now, everybody agreed on the need to abstain from idolatry. Not all agreed what should be a Christian's attitude toward classical pagan culture. This included the works of people like Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, whose wisdom was admired even up to this day. And to reject all that would be to set aside some of the highest achievement of man. To accept it could be seen as a concession to paganism, which would lead to idolatry in the church. So, the question of the value of classical culture, we're taking now two opposite tracks by the Christian faith. Some insisted on radical opposition between Christian faith and pagan culture. The typical attitude was that of Tertullian, who summarized it in a famous phrase, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does the academy have to do with the church?" And it prompted him to write these lines, that it was his conviction that many of the heresies that circulated during his time were the result of attempts to combine pagan philosophy with Christian doctrine. Same thing's going on in the church today. It's just crazy. But even apart from the question of heresy, there were those who gloried in the barbarian originality or origin of Christianity over the claims of classical culture and philosophy. That was the case with Tatian. That was the case with Justin Martyr, who wrote Address to the Greeks, a frontal attack to all the Greeks considered valuable. Like Aristotle, like Plato. And he defended the barbaric Christians, because Greeks called all those who did not speak Greek barbarians. So Tatian began by pointing out to them that they were not in agreement as to how Greek was to be spoken. Every region had its own dialect. Furthermore, argued Tatian, the people who claim that their tongue is the greatest of human creations have also invented rhetoric, which is the art of selling words for gold to the highest bidder. And that resulted in the defense of untruth and injustice. And all the Greeks that have that thought, or if that thought is of any value to them, said Tatian, they've taken from barbarians. That they learned astronomy from the Babylonians, geometry from the Egyptians, writing from the Phoenicians. And the same is true of philosophy and religion. Since the writings of Moses, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are much older than that of Plato and even Homer, any agreement between that culture, which is supposedly Greek, and, highbrow, and the religion of Christians and Hebrews and being barbarians, is a result of the Greeks having learned their wisdom from those people, from the Hebrews, from the early Christians. And what makes matters worse is that the Greeks, in reading that the wisdom of the barbarians, misunderstood it. The Greeks twisted the truth that the Hebrew knew. So in consequence, the supposed wisdom of the Greeks is a pale reflection and caricature of the truth that was known by Moses. It's so cool. So if this is what Trajan said about classical Greek culture, one can only imagine what he has to say about pagan gods. Homer and the other Greek poets tell of shameful things, like adultery, incest, infanticide. How are we to worship those types of gods that are clearly inferior to us? Finally, Tatian adds, let it not be forgotten that many of the statues that the pagans worshipped are in fact representations of prostitutes, whom the sculptors used as models, and I'm sure got a little secondary benefits from them. So, as the very pagans who say the Christians belong to the lower social strata are in fact worshiping people in even lower classes. You get it? Now, another tract of some Christians took a different stance. On becoming a Christian, Justin didn't cease being a philosopher. Justin Martyr rather took himself to the task of Christian philosophy. And a major part of that task, as he saw it, was to show and explain the connection between Christianity and classical wisdom. So he didn't share Tatian's negative attitude toward philosophy, toward wisdom. But it doesn't mean he was willing to compromise his faith, or that he was lacking in conviction, because when the time came for him to stand up for his faith, he did so with courage. That's why he got the name Justin Martyr. He claimed that there were several points of contact between Christianity and pagan philosophy. The best philosophers, he thought, spoke of a supreme being from which every other being derives its existence. Socrates and Plato affirmed life beyond physical death. They believed in a hereafter. And Socrates showed the strength of that affirmation by the manner in which he died. Plato knew that there are realities beyond our present world, and thus, posited, basically correct, that although he didn't always agree on the manner in which they understood them, for instance, in contrast to the philosophers, Christian hope is not based on the immortality of the soul, but rather the resurrection of the body. And then, reunited with the soul and spirit. But in spite of all these Christian differences, Justin Martyr insisted that there were, in the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, glimpses of truth that could not be explained as mere coincidence. And I think he's got a point. So how can one explain this partial agreement between the philosophers and Christianity? For Justin Martyr, the answer is in the doctrine of the Logos. That's a Greek word that means word and reason. According to a tradition of long-standing in Greek philosophy, the human mind can understand reality because it shares in the Logos or universal reason that undergirds all reality. Give you an example. If we were to understand that 2 and 2 make 4, the reason for this is that both in our minds and in our universe there is a logos, a reason, or order, according to which 2 and 2 always makes 4. The 4 Gospels affirm that in Jesus, the logos, or word, was made flesh. So according to Justin Martyr, what's happened in the incarnation is that the underlying reason of the universe, the logos, or word of God, Jesus Christ, came into the flesh. Now that's a tough argument to bat around, right? Now according to the 4th Gospel, this logos, John's Gospel, is the true light that enlightens everybody. Now he philosophizes that this meant, even before the incarnation, that Jesus was the source of all true knowledge. In 1 Corinthians 10:1-4, Paul said that the ancient Hebrew faith rested on none other than Christ, who had been revealed to them even before his incarnation. So Justin Martyr adds that there were also among the pagans those who knew the same logos, the same Jesus Christ, the same word, even if they knew it dimly. Whatever truths there are in the writings of Plato was granted to him by the Logos of God, the same Logos who was incarnate in Jesus. Therefore, in a way, Socrates, Plato, and some of the other sages of antiquity were Christians. At least they had the Christian wisdom, which came from Christ. But that doesn't say that the incarnation was not needed. For those philosophers of old knew the Logos in part, whereas those who have seen him, like the apostles and Paul, know him fully. That's why Paul could write all those great epistles, because he knew him fully. He was out there in the Arabian desert with him 3 years. But what Justin Martyr did do was to open the way for Christianity to claim whatever good it could find in classical culture, in spite of its being pagan. And following his inspiration, soon there were other Christians who tried to build further bridges between their faith and ancient culture. But their work and the dangers that were inherent will be seen elsewhere in this narrative as dangerous. And that's going to do it for my teaching today on the story of Christianity. And this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. You've been listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you'll have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.